Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. May God's infinite peace, blessings, and compassion be upon all of you. Thank you so much, Shamar. Thank you so much, Father Mark Francis, for your words. I'd like to thank the Bernadine Center for their support, as well as the Waraich Foundation for their support, without whom we would not also be here. And though he may not, and I also would like to thank all the support staff that helped us to put this program together. And though he may not want to be recognized, I also would like to thank my dear brother and colleague, Professor Scott Alexander, because wherever the vision came from, it would not have been possible without his undeniable, infinite support. And so I am in complete and utter gratitude for him. So in the Quran, in chapter 42, verse 40, it says, "Let harm be recompensed with equal harm. But anyone who forgives and puts things right, their reward will be with God." And there's a report about the Prophet Muhammad, may God's peace and blessings be upon him. A man came to him and he wanted to confess to a transgression that he committed. And he said, "O Prophet, I have committed this transgression and I want you to punish me, so as a way of expiation." And so the Prophet asked him, he said, "Did you just make a ritual abolition with us?" And the man responded, "Yes." Then he said, "Did you just in fact pray with us?" And the man responded, "Yes." So the Prophet said, "Then go away, you are already forgiven." And in another instance, the second caliph, the religious political leader after the death of the Prophet, Umar bin Khattab, one time a man came with another man. And the first man said, "Umar, I have brought this man, he stole food from me, and I wish for you to punish him." And Umar replied, he said, "I would rather have two people in my community with half stomachs than one person with a full stomach and the other one that is going to be punished." And as we all know, I think most of us know, that when folks brought a alleged adulteress to Jesus to be stoned, he said, "Let he cast the first stone who has never sinned." I bring all these accounts as well as the Quranic verse to demonstrate that punishment, it would seem, or trying to get someone punished, does not appear to be the objective. And yet that is exactly what we do in the criminal justice system right now. That the function of the criminal law is very much to punish someone, and that there isn't any other option available. And so the speakers that have come today will talk about the ways in which we can reimagine how to deal with offenses, or how to deal with the ways in which we try to direct our society in a more just and ethical way. So in terms of the layout of the program, I'm going to introduce the first two speakers. Thereafter, we will give the audience a few minutes to collect their thoughts, and I will give some direction on in what exact way. After that, we'll have a conversation with the two speakers and then close out with a Q&A. So the first speaker is Professor Najiba Syeed. Professor Syeed is recognized as a leader in peace building. She twice received the John Anson Ford Award for reducing violence in schools and interracial gang conflicts, and was named Southern California Mediation Association's Peacemaker of the Year in 2007. Her research articles have focused on mediation between law enforcement and communities, intersections of law with religious minority communities, interfaith just peacekeeping. She serves as an advisor to local and federal agencies on interfaith dialogue, cooperation, and public engagement. I'm sorry? In the past administration, I am sorry. And that's right. And most recently in Interfaith Youth Group Corp. Thank you for that. Professor Cruz has gained insight into the role of religion in society by working as a faith-based community organizer and as a lay ecclesial minister in his native California. Dr. Cruz joined the St. John's University faculty in 2014 and teaches courses in ethics and theology, as well as the capstone course for the undergraduate minor in social justice, theory and practice in the Venetian tradition. As a practitioner of moral advocacy, he volunteers with religious communities as they advocate for the rights and well-being of U.S. Farm workers. His current research focuses on justice for farm workers and moral theories of social equality. So please join me in welcoming first Professor Najeeba Syeed. Thank you.
So I want to begin our journey tonight with 3 stories. So I walk into a room. This is the first time I'm doing a criminal justice mediation in what's called the victim offender model. So I walk in. This is the first case. I've been trained while in law school. This is almost probably about 18 years ago. So I walk into this room and I think, okay, I'm here to offer a restorative justice process that's going to keep a juvenile out of the criminal justice system. So I walk in and I see a child who is 9 years old sitting at the table. A child who is small for his age because of serious developmental issues. So I see a 9-year-old child sitting at the table who's already a part of the United States criminal justice system. So this is my first case, fresh out of law school, fresh out of idealism, and it literally broke me to see a 9-year-old child sitting at a table with his mother behind him. So I think, what is this case going to be about? What will we be addressing? Who walks in? A South Asian woman. And I ask her, what do you do? She says, I'm the ice cream truck driver in the neighborhood where this little boy lives. So in restorative justice and victim offender processes, we actually start with the storytelling. So I'm listening to this story. A 9-year-old boy, he was hungry one day. And what did he do? He took some money from the ice cream truck that came to his neighborhood every day. This child, if he did not have this process, would have probably ended up in our criminal justice system, incarcerated, tied to the system, his family under scrutiny. And we don't know if this was the beginning of what the state does, which is break families down through our criminal justice system. We've had family separation in this country for generations. So it was an incredible process, and as we did this was one of many dozens that I've done over the last few years, and I can't tell you details, and I don't share this work online for that reason. But what struck me is the solution that the ice cream truck driver and this 9-year-old boy came up with was he was going to work for her a couple afternoons after school because she cared so deeply about this boy. She had a relationship with him. If they had gone through our criminal justice system, they would have never met one another. They would have never had that conversation, and this boy would have been shuttled and his family into our criminal justice system in a way that would have completely and perhaps indelibly left a reality that he may not have escaped from. So I wanted to share that one story with you. Then the second story, I'm brought into the juvenile courthouse. 6 young Latinx girls, 6 young African-American women, high school. They had a spat on their school grounds. Just teenage girls having a spat. What happens when you're Latinx and African-American in the criminal justice system? You get gang enhancement charges. You get racially motivated charges. So these 6 young, 12 women in this room, the judge says, Najeeba, I want you to come and mediate this conflict. I get the police on board. I get all the parents on board, all the lawyers on board. This story doesn't end like the other one does because the DA or the district attorney above us, we got the DA in the room to agree after several meetings. Everyone is on board because they had a spat. They had some disagreement on the schoolyard in their high school, and these girls wanted to talk it out. The DA decided against it and prosecuted all of these young women. These young women are now left with gang enhancement charges when they wanted to just have a conversation. And we actually got the police officers involved in the case to agree. I mean, that was a lot of work, but it happened. And so I think I'm illustrating to you some of the cases that come to the reality of our criminal justice system. The last story I wanted to share with you is actually at a mosque in South Central LA on Swasin. My doctoral student is the imam there, and I teach comparative theologies of restorative justice. So I taught with my colleague Monica Coleman, we taught African American Islams, and we took my students to visit, and he said, oh, just come this afternoon. So we were there on a random afternoon, and about 30 second to fourth graders sat around and did restorative circles. So he'd taken what he'd learned in class, and now these students, mostly African American in South LA, in an area that is heavily policed, heavily criminalized by our police, they sat there and they worked out their conflicts as a community, young Muslim children, saying, so someone took someone's phone, what do we do about that as a community? So they sat in a circle. I have to tell you, my kids sitting for 2 to 4 hours negotiating in this restorative justice circle. So it was incredible to see restorative justice being used that way, a community taking its own possession of their agency for resolving conflicts. And in fact, what Imam Jihad Safir has done now is using restorative justice with adults and tied it to the notion of shura, of consultation, that we don't just do restorative justice as it's taught in other places, but we have a model that comes from Muslim history. But I wanted to share that story with you because that 9-year-old child, there was something about it that every time I think about this idea of restorative justice, I think about the fact that he had, in some ways, that way off, that way off. But most children do not. Most children do not have that option. It is not a consistent option in our criminal justice system. So to me, restorative justice is not about just one program. It's not about one intervention. It's about rethinking how we do justice as a collective community. I want to remind you very quickly, today is Wrongful Convictions Day. 22,000 years have been lost by people who were convicted for a crime they never did. That's 22,000 years that we know of. It also doesn't name the people that were killed, like Emmett Till and others, and by our criminal justice system. So those are the years lost of life, but we haven't talked about the lives that were lost as well. So one of the things I'm going to talk about today is I wanted to mention, I'm not going to do a fiqh discussion tonight, which means discussion of the jurisprudence of restorative justice. What I wanted to do is talk about, as Rabia Terry Harris thinks through the way we do theology, is engaging narratives, whether it's the narratives of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ or the narratives of communities. Because very often we do religion. Imam Jihad's second to fourth graders were doing religion in that restorative justice circle, right? They're coming up with an alternative modality, so they're doing religion. So I wanted to kind of frame that for you today, that this is what my goal is. And I wanted to talk about how we as bodies do this work and how Islam has formed my work. Because like Frere and others, I don't believe in a separation between theory and practice. I don't believe in a separation between activism and scholarship. I think that they inform one another. So one of the interventions that Islam brings to this conversation is the Quran in Surah Rahman. I base my restorative justice work on that whole surah, or that whole chapter. It says, وَلَا تُخْسِرُ الْمِيزَانِ. This idea, I'll read it to you in English, is that within the Muslim tradition, we have very often in the Western notion, in the depiction aesthetically of justice, is a woman or some type of holding of a scale. The contribution of this surah and this practice is that mizan, the idea of justice or scale, is ecosystemic, not weights per se. The dimensions are not just two sides weighing good and bad, but they actually are multidimensional. So the Quran says, and the heaven he raised and imposed the balance. This is talking about Allah. That you do not transgress the balance. And establish weight in justice, do not be deficient in this balance. So justice is not good versus bad. Justice is not aesthetically two-dimensional. It is multidimensional, and it is grounded in the balance of all creation. So it is an ecosystemic approach to justice. It looks at the ecosystem that a person exists in. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit more, because I think the very metaphor of justice that you bring to the table informs how you engage justice. And if that model is a binary good versus bad, people inevitably are put into that category, one or the other. And the recovery from one into the other means very often one has to go through whatever that society establishes around lack of privilege, lack of access. So in the Muslim model, I talk about this ecosystemic sense of justice, that our dignity is intertwined, and that the sign from God around justice, mizan, is an aesthetic balance. That when there is a transgression by humans, it in fact engages the larger ecosystem, not just the one-on-one. So Zaire and others in their work around restorative justice talk about 3 pillars of restorative justice. The one is that we look at harms and related needs. So in the Zaire model of restorative justice, we look at victims first of all, but also communities and offenders. So this idea of looking at communities. The second foundation or pillar, Dr. Alexander and I were talking about the pillars of Islam. The second pillar of restorative justice is the obligations that have resulted from and given rise to this harm. Offenders, but also the community. So this idea of restorative justice is, again, engaging the community. The third is the engagement of those who have a legitimate interest or stake in the offense and its resolution. So it's defined by Zaire as victims, offenders, and community members. So I'm just giving you a little bit of the background of restorative justice. I can go into the genealogy of the Mennonite Peace Church tradition and others, but that's another lecture, so I'm not going to spend time on that. You can take my comparative theologies of restorative justice class. But those are the foundations of restorative justice as it's often practiced. So there have been some very, I think, helpful reflections on restorative justice by Susan Haskell, as well as by Palestinian scholar Kafashe, looking at the idea of restorative justice from a very juristic perspective. So today I'm not focusing on the juristic perspective, the types of punishments within Islam where there is an emphasis on forgiveness. I would encourage you to look at some of the scholars that I've mentioned, but today I'm really focused on the lived or practical theology of restorative justice. There is also another scholar that I would encourage you to read who looks at the cultural histories of reconciliation, Muhammad Abu Nimr, who looks at, for instance, tribal peacemaking patterns of Arab Bedouins. So restorative justice in the Muslim ecosystem grows not just out of religious practices, but out of cultural practices. For those of you that are here in the south side of LA, we know the history of the Nation of Islam, which used restorative justice instead of criminalizing those that were dealing with dependency issues, actually offered some of the first alternative counseling mechanisms for people who needed to access those healing processes. So what I wanted to share today was, what were some of the principles that a Muslim model of restorative justice, what does it look like? And for me, it's always important that this work grow out of being tested in community on a regular basis. So one of the things that I think is really powerful for the Muslim community when we come into this idea of restorative justice is that we have an ummatic concept of human organization. So there is a hadith, a saying of Prophet Muhammad's, that says the body of Muslims, or the corporate body of Muslims, is like the body of a human, that one part hurts, the whole body hurts. So it takes the Zairean model of community and says, not only are we concerned about the victim, not only are we concerned about the ecosystem that created the conditions in which someone might commit what's considered a crime, but we actually feel the pain that both of them are going through. So it takes us from that binary, that idea of justice as a scale, good versus evil, into this notion that when we are establishing justice within the Muslim community, it has an ummatic nature. It comes from the ummah. It comes from our concern that my dignity is inherently related to your dignity. So I think this is a really powerful concept, because what it does is, when there is a violation of rights of another human being, this ummatic concept says, but we are of one body. But we are of one community that is not only related to one another because of efficiency, because of religious identity, but it's related because we have an embodied empathy for one another. That is a powerful statement to say to a child who's 9 years old, to say, we don't just love you. We are not just responsible for you, but we understand that we have a role in what has happened. We are responsible. You are not responsible only on your own. The second concept that I wanted to talk about here is ahsan al-taqweem, the somatic concept, that the human being is considered in the Quran the most beautiful, the most excellent, the human form itself. I'm a mover. I move a lot when I usually lecture. So the human being, the body itself, is a very sacred category of creation. And I share this because it inevitably brings to us this notion of no harm. And how do we think about, I cannot justify to you a criminal justice system where in seeking we call it retributive justice, I cannot support a system. I just met with a young lady. Her partner in LA was a college student that went to jail for some ticket. He was killed in jail by the deputies. So how do I justify a criminal justice system that in the process violates the bodies of those that are caged by that system? How do I justify that as a Muslim? How do I seek to justify what happens when a criminal justice system, in seeking justice itself, is violating the bodies of those who it has taken possession of? It should be a higher, I'm an abolitionist by nature, it should be a higher level of human responsibility if you're taking the possession of the body of another for no harm. It shouldn't be that we lower our standard. It should be heightened, right? Ideally. So this idea of ahsan al-taqweem, the idea of that the criminal justice system itself, the state operating in what John Galton talks about as structural violence, when the state becomes an agent of violence itself in seeking justice. The other thing I think in the Muslim tradition that's really important, in addition to this metaphor of justice, is that the earth herself is a part of this justice system. So this ecosystemic approach, Surah Zilzal in the Quran tells us, on the day of judgment, the earth will be asked to testify against human beings for what we've done to her. I think one of the things we're going to have to testify is on borders, but that's another topic, why we created borders. But this is very powerful. The Quran also tells us that the animals and the insects have ummas like us. They have civilizations like human beings. So for a Muslim, the restorative justice process engages the earth herself. The earth is animated with a voice. The earth has a space. And I mention this because when we see borders being used for incarceration, when we see climate justice left out of racial justice, when we see people doing activism for climate justice without understanding that migration is now tied to the violation that human beings have done to the earth. So these are all interrelated concepts for me. The idea that the earth herself is a part of restorative justice. We can't restore human beings to a point of justice while violating the earth. And in fact, the possession of the earth leads to the possession of human beings. The idea that we can at first violate other beings and creatures leads us to this notion. So I say that because Surah Rahman again and again reminds us that the objects, even the trees themselves, are in prostration to God. There is a story of Prophet Sulaiman. he hears an ant. Sulaiman is Solomon in other traditions. He hears an ant, and he has a large army. And the ant says something, and Sulaiman changes the course of his army. So this is a story that children learn in Sunday school. My kids learn it. But I've actually spent a lot of time thinking about this story, because one of the things that this story, when I was younger, I used to think, well, it means one person can change history. But what I think it really means is we have to listen, and we have to be better listeners to those who are at the margins, those whose voices are so soft because they've been pushed out. They could be yelling, they could be loud, but they're whispering to me, not because they're whispering or they don't have a voice, but because I'm not listening. So more and more I've been thinking about this idea of restorative justice, that we haven't been listening to the creatures of the earth as well as the earth herself. So that we think about structural violence along John Galton's work, and also cultures of violence, thinking of Elise Boulding's work, a Quaker scholar, and thinking through how are we connecting the work that we do of restorative justice to how we live either in peace or in violence with the earth. Because once we do violence to the earth, it's created so many other conditions for human beings that have been highly toxic and lead even to incarceration, as we see with migrants in the United States. So the two last things that I wanted to mention that we bring in addition to this earth-based concept is the empathetic embodied approach to justice. Imam al-Ghazali says, for us to have empathy, we have to feel the pain, we have to physically feel the pain of the person who's going through that pain. So part of what restorative justice needs to do is address the empathy gap in the United States that has been studied in social psychology that is highly racialized. If any of you have looked at the literature, it is clear through multiple sources of studies, one of them being that the majority of white Americans believe that African Americans do not experience pain in the same way. That literally, they don't experience pain in the same way. And that is a heavily dehumanizing structure of thought, because what it does is allow you to inflict pain. And this is part of the issue that we also need to address in restorative justice, is how the justice system is based on white supremacy. And I'll just briefly, this is around maternal justice, but also African American women experience it in hospitals, where even Serena Williams recently was in a very famous woman with much privilege. The idea that black women don't experience pain in childbirth, or they don't need to be addressed, that pain is not taken seriously. So this is not just a theological construct, this is not my observation, this is sociologically studied. So Imam al-Ghazali, this Muslim perspective, says we have to work on our empathy. We have to understand that we have blockages to empathy, whether those blockages are theological, whether they are racism, whatever those sources are. And sometimes they can even be science itself. This idea that, people experience or don't experience pain comes from histories of where many of these knowledges have been developed. So I think it's really important to keep in mind this empathy gap, and that empathy is not merely an abstract concept, but Imam al-Ghazali, as well as some of the other things we've talked about around the human body, it's an embodied experience. So if you are not feeling empathy when you see pain of others, the pathology is not in the person who's experiencing the pain. The pathology is in the person who can't see or feel the pain. So I think it's really important, because restorative justice and other forms of justice have been used to pathologize communities that are dealing with a racist criminal justice system. And sometimes we have to think about where does the pathology lie? And I just wanted us to think through that, because I think that empathy gap is something that really needs to be addressed, and something that Imam al-Ghazali speaks eloquently about from a theological and religious perspective. The other thing I think is really important, the fourth pillar, would be the interdependence, that the stakeholder language becomes much wider when we spiritualize this conversation. The idea of a theology of interdependence. It's not just interpersonal peacemaking, you and I getting along. It's not just that young man and the ice cream truck driver getting along. We have, unfortunately, in many religious spaces, engaged theologies of reconciliation that say if we just get along, issues of justice will be taken care of. If we just get along, you and I, from two different religious backgrounds, that solves the problem. I call this the myth of interpersonal peacemaking. It has to engage the notion of how justice is manifested at the structural level. So when I'm negotiating with someone through even a victim offender or a restorative justice process, I bring into that room everything that is outside of that room. So I'm really cautious as you move forward with this program. Think through how you utilize words like peace, how you utilize words like reconciliation. I no longer, for instance, do dialogues on race. I'll be happy to do a dialogue on racism, but I won't get together just to talk about race, because that takes away the social history, the political reality, and the function that race plays without acknowledging racism. So I just wanted to share some of these ideas with you. And I had a whole set of, of prophetic Prophet Muhammad's examples around restorative justice, but maybe we can address that in the Q&A time. But I wanted to pull back a little bit to have us think through what and how do we conceive of justice, who and what is the role of larger community constructs of empathy, what does justice look like to you in terms of who is responsible for it? What happens when the state turns on its own? What is the role of religious leaders in that model? And last of all, to think through from our own scriptural histories, our own traditions, where and when have we seen examples of justice that's manifested that takes into account not just those that have power, but when do we think of a system that can reimagine justice in such a way that compassion is not just at its center, but like the Quran tells us, the mission of Prophet Muhammad Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was rahmatan lil alameen, which means was to be a mercy to all of creation, not just to Muslims. This is when we have to think of compassion beyond our own. But what I was going to share with you, that rahama is the same in Hebrew, and the rahama is womb, is from the womb. So it's not just mercy, but it's a radical compassion. How can our sense of how we create justice move towards a womb-like radical compassion for all human beings? And I would extend it even to the creatures of the earth itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Syeed, for this. Very thought-provoking. Now I'd like to invite up Dr. Jeremy Cruz.
Let me also extend my thanks to everyone who's had a hand in bringing me here today. I was really honored to be invited, to be part of this, and to be in conversation with Najeeba, who I've admired. I've admired her work from a distance for quite some time now. A slight tweak to the title of my remarks. The title said I was going to focus on policing. I'm actually going to focus more on the prison side of the system, thinking more about policing as the tentacles or the arms, the armed arms of the carceral system. So I'm going to focus on the carceral system of punishment, specifically drawing more attention to the prison side in my remarks. When I was about 21 years old, this was about in 2002, don't do the math, in Southern California, I accepted an invitation to participate in the Match 2 Prisoner Visitation Program. I participated in the program as a mentor for a little over a year. And the program had been wildly successful at reducing recidivism rates within California's prisons. I don't recall the exact rates, but the disparity in the numbers of people who would return to prison after being released, the disparity was between those who were mentored in the prison and those who were not mentored was dramatic. It was exponential. The Match 2 program was a Christian-inspired nonprofit organization that received funding from state and private sources to establish its ministries in prisons, helping people answer the call of Jesus' parable in Matthew 25, "For I was in prison and you visited me." The aim of the program was to mentor interested prisoners, those who applied to the program, in order to support them in moving toward a, quote, lifestyle that does not include crime, unquote. Additionally, the program aimed to solidify we who were mentees, solidify us in our confidence that rehabilitation is possible and often a better alternative to incarceration. The idea being we would be in the prison, we'd be mentoring, we would see the transformation of people, and we would become more confident that rehabilitation is possible, that incarceration isn't the only answer. However, the ministry was not designed to teach us much about state sentencing practices or prison violence and prison health conditions, or about how little structured rehabilitation actually occurs in prisons. Without that, the program actually made us more confident in the value of mentoring people within the controlled setting of a prison. We saw the transformation in this environment. The transformation was possible. Why question that? The program's effects on recidivism not only satisfied the Christian mission of the organization, but seemingly also the financial interests of a state that spends more on new prison construction than on new school construction. So I was matched with a Mexican-American man, we'll call him Marcos, who was about 5 years older than me and approaching the end of his sentence. We would meet roughly once or twice or maybe 3 times a month, depending on my availability. This prison was in the city neighboring the one where I lived. And we would also write to each other on occasion, though mail seemed to always move at a snail's pace. I would show up before my letter arrives for my next meeting. And vice versa. Our letters were always read by the prison staff. That sort of slows things down. Marcos and I would just talk about life, about our families, our girlfriends. Marcos shared struggles on the inside. I asked about what life was like on the inside. He asked what was happening on the, as he called it, the outside world. Marcos shared his hopes for the future. He asked questions about his Catholic faith, which both arose from his suffering and his questions, all the faith questions that arise from intense suffering, and that also arose amid and in response to all of the proselytizing that happened within the prison from various angles. Marcos was lonely, very lonely. I was the only person who visited him in prison. And it was very common for prisoners to never have any visitors, especially if they didn't participate in a program like Match 2. His mother and grandmother lived fairly far away. Visiting him was cost prohibitive for the family, but also it was too painful for his mother and grandmother to see him in that place. And so they, for a variety of reasons, they didn't come to visit. I really enjoyed my time with Marcos. Sometimes we'd meet for an hour in the controlled space of the prison visitation hall, sometimes for 2 hours or more. I was allowed to buy him some junk food from the vending machines, and we'd sit inside the meeting hall or out on the enclosed patio with other prisoners who were having visitation at the same time. We developed a friendship. I didn't think of him sort of outside of a framework of friendship. We were developing a friendship. I was really getting to know a lot about him, and he was getting to know a lot about me. He seemed very familiar to me, like some of my childhood friends, though life had aged him such that the age gap between us felt much wider than 5 years. He He'd aged a lot faster than I had. One day I learned that the state, under the centrist Democratic leadership of Governor Gray Davis, had decided to end the funding of Match 2 for the prison within which I was doing this visitation. The state was running a budget deficit, and the program's funding was sacrificed on the altar of balanced budgeting. It didn't matter that the program was a cost-saving measure, not to mention a life-saving, family-saving, and community-saving investment. Austerity won the day. This made me question the state's interests in the ministry. Seemed penny-wise and pound-foolish to me. Who was lining the pockets of the political leaders? How did this make financial sense for taxpayers if the program was so wildly successful in keeping people out of prison? As the program was winding down, Marcos was also preparing As the program was winding down, Marcos was also preparing for his release, though he didn't know the precise date. That could come on very short notice. But he was preparing after serving several years in prison. I don't remember the full length of the sentence. He told me that he had served a long sentence for the theft of a stereo in a store. And he served this long sentence because he had already served time once for a similar offense. The judge's sentencing discretion was limited by California's three-strike sentencing laws, which were not reformed until 2012. Under the 1994 three strikes law in California, if someone had been convicted of a felony, the second time they were convicted, they would receive twice the normal penalty for the offense. So amid the various things we talked about, Marcos was very concerned that at some point he would run afoul of the law one more time during his life and be sentenced to the minimum 25 years in prison after he'd already spent, the better part of a decade in prison. In the final months of his sentence, Marcos shared with me his concern that he would be deported to Mexico upon being released. Mexico was where his father lived. But he had grown up and lived his entire life in the United States. He had been brought to California as a very young child. He didn't know anything about surviving in Mexico, especially not with just the clothes on his back, basically, that he would have upon release. As he explained it to me, his temporary status visa was set to expire while incarcerated, and he could not renew it while in prison. He said that his only chance at remaining in the country would be if the state prison authorities did not coordinate well his release with federal immigration authorities. I think this was the Immigration and Naturalization Service at the time, the INS. As Marcos understood it, prospective deportees would often escape deportation if there was a breakdown in communications between the state and federal agencies, but that was kind of his only chance to stay in the country. I had been told all along. So at this point, I had a choice to make. I had been told all along that whether or not I chose to meet with my match once they were released from prison, it was up to me. I got a little bit of advice, don't invite a former prisoner to your home just as you would invite, any stranger to your home immediately upon release. Get to know them, but it's up to you whether or not you want to see them once they're not in the controlled setting of the prison. I spent some time, felt conflicted about it, but ultimately I decided to give Marcos the number to my parish office. I was working in a parish as a youth minister at the time, and in the prison we were not permitted writing implements, and we were also not permitted to bring anything from outside and give it to the prisoners, something that they would take back to their cages. And so I remember writing my phone number on a napkin with a mustard packet and letting it sit on the table and dry while we had our conversation. And the hope was that Marcos would be able to smuggle that back into his cage and have my phone number, for his, once he was released. I like to think of that napkin as a sacrament of the mustard seed of faith that brought me into the prison and brought Marcos to accept a match and brought us to trust each other. Upon Marcos's release, I didn't hear from him for many months. Maybe 3 months passed, or 6 or more. I don't remember. It felt like a very long time. One day I was working in my parish office when I received a collect call from Mexico. It was very difficult to hear, very low quality connection, but I was pretty sure it was Marcos trying to make the connection. I tried to accept the call, but for some reason it didn't go through, it didn't connect. I've never heard from him again. What do I take from this experience as I reflect on it now, almost 2 decades later? The first thing is that this empire's elaborate system of walls and cages is much bigger than me. It's much bigger than us. It's much bigger than our feeble attempts at accompaniment. That's a hard thing to bear. This system devours people. It destroys families. It shatters communities. It's not enough to accompany people within the confines of these socially dismembering walls and cages. We must bring down the walls and cages. I feel good about the work I did in that prison when I was 21, but it wasn't nearly enough. Not for Marcos, not for every other Marcos and Marquita in the prisons today. The second thing I'm thinking about is that bringing down walls and cages has always required not only legislative lobbying initiatives, which in the Catholic Church we already don't do all that well, but also social confrontation and disruption. It requires building and leveraging our power, resisting demonic cultural forces, turning over tables. It requires Catholic prison ministries that look more like abolitionist movements and less like polite service provision within the parameters set for us by those who control the system. In the words of your dear Professor Carmen Nanco Fernandez, it requires hostilidad pastoral, pastoral hostility. As I think about it, and as I've had some conversations in preparation for being with you, had conversations with people who are much more enmeshed in prison ministries and prison abolition movements today than I am. That's not my primary work of advocacy and community organizing is in the space of labor. As I spoke with other people, I thought about a dual problem that I see on the Catholic side of the equation. One is so few Catholics are willing to do prison work, even though it's right there in our Catholic teachings. It's a corporal work of mercy. It's something considered central to the faith. Additionally, we're defunding these programs, just as I experienced with the state defunding the program. Catholic institutions are defunding prison ministries, and we can talk about the reasons why. They're multiple. Maybe during the discussion we can explore that further. But there's a second aspect to this dual problem, and it's that I asked leaders of policing reform movements, prison abolition movements, prison reform movements, who are the Catholics doing this work in a very public-facing way? Who are the Catholics who are leading, who are in positions of leadership in these movements? And one after another, I got shrugs. I go, yeah, I don't really know any. No, it's Muslims. No, it's Jews. No, it's a lot of secular folks. Nobody could tell me. They couldn't give me anyone. And so I'm asking the question, I'm partly asking the question from, I come from St. John's University, the Vincentians, we're the food pantry and soup kitchen folks. Why are we so good at direct service provision and so unwilling to do the work of making these services unnecessary? I'm on the National Planning Committee right now for the Jornada por la Justicia. It's a teach-in and a public action at the border in El Paso 2 weeks from now, the 11th through the 13th. pray for us. If you're able to book a flight at the last minute, join us. We'll be at the Hope Border Institute doing great work. One of the things that's really struck me in that space is how good our Catholic institutions have been at providing services to migrants, even legal services, vitally needed legal services, but how little work of community organizing, power building, disruption, confrontation has happened. Once we started planning the jornada in the first week of July, small actions started popping up in other places. A bunch of sisters got arrested in DC at the Capitol. A few weeks after that in Newark, a number of us gathered in Newark and engaged in civil disobedience. This is a little late. We're 3 years into this presidency, and we are several decades and 4 or 5 presidents into mass deportation. And so I want to lift up the question that's part of this problem. Why are we so good at direct service provision and so unwilling to take risks? I do have a positive vision. It's not all sin. It's not all sin. I want to see Catholics at the forefront of police reform and prison abolition movements. I want to see a Catholic abolition movement. I think it's possible. Not just responding, yes, responding, but not just responding to Matthew's, I was in prison and you visited me. But I want to see Catholics participate in the ministry of Luke's Jesus, whose synagogue manifesto reads, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom to the prisoners and to set the oppressed free. We as U.S. Catholics are very good at upholding existing systems. We're pretty good at direct service, at trying to do good within these systems. I want us to be better at the work of transforming our social institutions to align with human dignity, showing preferential concern, not blind justice, but justice that sees what's going on, and shows preferential concern for those who are defined as outside of the public, and therefore whose safety we disregard in our pursuits of public safety. Nothing is more unsafe than a prison. Preferential concern for those who are defined as outside the nation, and thus outside of our concern for national security. So maybe some small solutions, or how do we move forward? How do we move toward this vision? I don't know how I'm doing on time. I'm probably just about up. I'm wrapping it up. A few things, and one we're doing right now, and it's why I'm here. It's why I accepted the invitation. Listen to Muslims. Muslims are doing the work already doing the work I'm talking about. One from Chicago comes immediately to mind, Miriam Kaba, who is now living in New York City. Miriam Kaba's work, her websites and blogs and social media are under the title Prison Culture. She's doing fantastic work, connected locally with organizations in Chicago, but also nationally. That's what the work of Catholic Muslim Studies here at CTU is about. So I want to praise and encourage that to continue. Listening to Muslims also means paying attention to the fact that prisoners convert to Islam within prisons at really high rates compared to any other religious tradition. There's something going on there. There's something to pay attention to. One of my students in my Race and Religion in the United States course, Marilyn Alexander, called my attention to this a couple years ago while doing research. And she talked about the ways in which Muslim prison ministries, especially associated with organizations like the Nation of Islam, cultivate a decolonial hope in prisoners, a hope that's transformative of both identity and of social systems and structures. and that people are responding and converting in part because it's this decolonizing hope that is taking root in these ministries. I think it's really important to pay attention to. So I guess for those of you here at CTU and here in Chicago, the question is, what can the church learn from CTU, from what you're already doing in these dialogues, but also how can you build on what you're doing so that CTU is a laboratory of dialogue and interfaith practice, specifically a laboratory for the church and for other religious communities of a anti-carceral, anti-punitive interfaith praxis. I think there's some incredible possibilities from within the space of a program that's been existing for 20 years and has been building doing the slow work of building relationships, interfaith relationships that are required for doing this work well. I'll lift up two other things that I think are worth paying attention to and engaging in and participating in. One is that within the Society of Christian Ethics, which meets annually jointly with the Society for the Study of Muslim Ethics and the Society of Jewish Ethics, there's a new working group called, and I forgot to write the exact name down, but it's something like Prison Abolition and Christian Ethics. It's a space for interfaith conversation, specifically, in a scholarly academic setting, specifically focused on prison abolition. The second thing I think is worth paying attention to and pushing, because it's certainly not an abolitionist movement, but there's a new coalition called Catholic Prison Ministries Coalition that's sort of a conglomeration of the various existing and struggling Catholic prison ministries who are attempting to do some things differently. And I think that participating and sort of supporting and resourcing and pushing their vision of toward, not just toward direct service provision and not just toward legislative lobbying, but toward the work of building power, community organizing, and engaging in the work of resistance and disruption that's required to bring down walls and cages. We have a real opportunity with this new coalition that's being built. So I want to end there and open up the conversation. I think there's a lot on the table for us to talk about. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cruz. Wow. That is pretty incredible remarks by both speakers. Just because of time, I wanted to shrink this latter part of the program a little bit. What I'd like to do, what I'd like to ask all of you is to get into groups of 3 or 4, and for the next 5 minutes, talk about, the exercise is called simple sharing. So take 1 to 2 sentences and describe what is the most impactful thing that you've taken away from these 2 amazing speakers. And then after the 5 minutes, we'll reconvene and then we'll interface with them and close out the evening after that. Great. So thank you. So I'll have a timer on, so go. All right, everybody. If I could draw your attention, please, back to the front of the room. So I heard a lot of conversation, so that is a good sign. Before we get into your comments and into your questions, I'd first invite both Professor Syeed and Professor Cruz to respond to the same question that I have, and which is that what are 1 or 2 things that you found impactful from the other person's comments?
I think one thing that was important was to also mention that Muslims are disproportionately present in the prison system. So Muslim advocates just released a report that says that Muslims are, I think, up to 10% of the prison population, which is disproportionate. And there's another report, I think it was released last year. So please check on the 10%. I don't know off the top of my head. I usually memorize most things, but I don't want to be, as an academic, quoted on it, but disproportionately represented in the prison population. Secondly, when it comes to punishment within the prison system, Muslims are often, have also been targets of things like solitary confinement. So depending on, there is a tie. I wanted just to point one thing that came out of the talk is the tie between the war on terror and the war on drugs. And for the Muslim community, we exist in the intersection between those two spaces. So when prisoners are seen as quote unquote radicalizing by becoming Muslim, then in addition to already being criminalized through the war on drugs, even if they had no connection to any form of transnational radicalism, and here I'm not excusing that radicalism, I think it's very problematic. I'm just pointing out that they are perceived as Muslims to being threats against the state in a different way than if they had a different religious identity. So I think that's important to mention as well, and particularly with Black Muslims in the United States already being targets of the war on drugs, and also the Latino Muslim population, Latinx Muslim population is the largest growing Muslim population in the country. So I think all of the intersectional issues that come with these communities tying to it, Islamophobia structurally through the prison system is something that we are just, I think is just beginning to be a part of the conversation. So that was one thing I wanted to mention briefly, is just who's already in prison is a major challenge as well, based on their embodiment and their background. So I would encourage people to look at that a little bit more as well.
What struck with me from Najeeba's remarks was the focus on doing religion, these second and fourth graders in these restorative justice circles.
They do it better than a lot of imams I know. Just kidding. Or maybe.
It's common when if you raise the problems that I raised in my remarks in Catholic settings, and sometimes you see it in published work, it's common to see the conversation very quickly move to what's wrong in Catholic social teaching that we need to fix this problem. And I think that the problem is much more rooted in lived religion, in the doing of religion. And that's related to what are the demographics of Catholic leadership? Who is in positions of leadership in Catholic institutions, and how does that shape the priorities of these institutions? How are those who are in these positions of leadership very closely tied, often themselves coming from police families, for example? There's a reason that my institution is a direct pipeline to the NYPD, one of the most well-documented abusive and corrupt police departments in the country. There's a historical reason for that, and there's a whole lived religion around that. There's a reason that, at St. John's University, one of the, Catholic values, Catholic service scholarships is for children of police officers. Our language of Christian service is leveraged not for the children of prisoners, but for the children of police officers, in acknowledgement of, thank you for your service, your sacrifices, et cetera, that affects your family, that we want to honor. It's a question of what is the lived religion and the material reality that shapes the priorities, what we honor, what we invest in, what we give space in our curricula to, et cetera, within our institutions. Another example of lived religion is that, I think of this much more as a ecclesiology and ministry problem than a Catholic social teaching problem. Catholic prison ministry has historically been the purview of priests and sisters going into the prisons. We have a collapsing ministry model and really transforming ministry model. And so part of the decline of Catholic prison ministry is very closely tied with the declining numbers of ordained ministers in the church and the declining numbers of vowed women religious. And we haven't yet figured out different ministry models that would be able to sustain these ministries long term.
Thank you.
I was just going to add, I think one of the major contributions that any community of religious orientation has in this is an open, clear, theological response to a form of capitalism that uses human bodies as chattel to sell and buy. We were just in front of Geo Group about 2 weeks ago, one of the largest private prison companies. And we have to talk about the privatization of this. So when we're not, so it's funny because I feel like we talk about the criminal justice system as if it's a state-operated, it is a state-operated entity now farmed out. By the way, also in the Iraq War, you know, this isn't just happening in the United States. As we prosecute wars around the United States, private contractors, private companies are in this space. And that means we're not just talking about state violence issues, but we're talking about benefiting. So to me, part of the extension as looking at Muslim ethics is what does it mean to make your money off of the incarceration, like the Geo group with Adelanto, which is an incredibly cruel detention center in Southern California, where a young man was in a coma. And we found out later on, and we worked with many of the detainees there, the physical conditions that they live under. And by the way, they are also slave labor for the manufacturing. So I just want to point this out because I think we can't talk about reforming the prison system without talking about being in a moment in history where it is profitable to use human bodies for forced labor. And I think that's a critique that we need to have a theological response to. That's not just liberation theology in terms of liberation from oppressive systems. It's also a very, I think, deeply, I think it's a role that clergy, both Muslim and otherwise, and Christian and Jew, all of us have to bring to the table. What is that critique that says, no, human beings matter. No, you know, they matter, and we can't make money this way off of